Crimes that remain unsolved for decades carry the weight of mystery and powerlessness. As time passes, hopes for justice fade, and the victims' families must cope not only with grief, but also with the uncertainty of whether they will ever know the truth. One such tragic story was the brutal murder of Sarah Yarbrough, a 16-year-old cheerleader whose life was suddenly and violently cut short one winter morning in 1991 on the grounds of her school in Federal Way, Washington. For nearly 3 decades, the investigation seemed to make no groundbreaking progress. The evidence collected, including numerous DNA samples, failed to identify the perpetrator, and every new lead seemed to be a dead end. However, the key piece of evidence that finally broke the impasse in the case turned out to be an inconspicuous cigarette butt. At the time the murder took place, the technology that could have helped identify the perpetrator was still in its infancy. But what was impossible in 1991 became possible thanks to a groundbreaking method: genetic genealogy. This advanced technique, which uses DNA data to trace family connections and track down criminals based on their relatives, was the key to solving this puzzle. After years of patient investigation and unexplained clues, technological breakthroughs allowed detectives to revisit Sarah Yarbrough's case and identify her killer. In this video, we will explore not only the crime itself, but also the investigation that lasted almost 30 years, and the role that the technological revolution, modern genetic genealogy, played in finally bringing justice. Sarah Marie Yarbrough was a talented 16-year-old student at Federal Way High School in Washington. She came from a warm, loving family that valued education and social involvement. Sarah was not only an exemplary student, but also a member of the school's dance team. Her team participated in many performances, and Sarah, as one of the most talented dancers, became a vital part of the group. Sarah was also known for being socially and actively involved in her school community. She had many friends who appreciated her warm and joyful personality. On Saturday, December 14th, 1991, Sarah was scheduled to meet with her cheerleading team for one of their morning practices. She participated in these practices every Saturday and loved them so much that she was determined not to be late. Dressed in her team uniform, she left her home early in the morning, driving herself to school. She arrived within a few minutes, but something felt off. The parking lot, where she usually struggled to find a spot, was completely empty. Other sports teams normally began their practices at the same time as well. Her confusion was interrupted when she looked at her watch. It turned out that the night before, after returning home from meeting a friend, she had accidentally set her alarm an hour early. With nothing else to do, she decided to wait in her car until practice began. When her teammates arrived, they immediately noticed Sarah's car. However, as they soon discovered, Sarah was nowhere to be found. They were sure that she wouldn't skip practice for any trivial reason, and certainly not without informing her teammates, especially since she had left her car in the school parking lot. Worried, they decided to call her parents to make sure that nothing had happened to her and to satisfy their curiosity. Unfortunately, they were informed that she was not at home. Her room was empty, and neither her uniform nor her ID badge was at home either, which clearly suggested that Sarah had intended to go to practice. Her parents were slightly concerned, but not panicked. They knew their daughter well. She was responsible, and the very fact that she had arrived at school was reassuring. After all, what could possibly go wrong at school? It was a safe place where she spent every day. On that fateful cold day, 2 young boys were playing near Federal Way High School. They had no idea that just a few meters away from them, someone was watching. As they began to approach a man hiding in the bushes, he suddenly emerged, stepping towards them. The boys saw a long-haired man with a blank expression on his face. His behavior, combined with the fact that he maintained eye contact while moving towards them, terrified the boys, causing them to retreat while keeping an eye on him. After a moment, the man quickened his pace, changed direction, and disappeared behind the school building. The 13-year-old sighed with relief. However, a lingering question remained. What was this man doing in the bushes, and why was he acting so strangely? The only way to answer their questions was to check the area where the man had emerged. Without hesitation, they decided to approach the spot. Upon entering the bushes, they discovered the partially undressed body of a young woman. The boys immediately fled the scene and ran to the home of one of their parents. Frightened and out of breath, the boys told the adults about their discovery, who then quickly alerted the authorities. The first person to arrive at the scene was a detective from the sheriff's office, who immediately noticed the name Sarah embroidered on the victim's clothing. Identifying the body was not difficult. The motive for the crime also seemed obvious at first glance. The girl's partially naked body, missing her underwear and bra, clearly indicated that this was a sexually motivated crime. Tightly knotted pantyhose were found around the victim's neck. Strangulation was the direct cause of death. The investigation began immediately, with the first people questioned being the boys who had discovered the body. Given their close encounter with the suspect, the police were able to create a sketch of the alleged killer who fled the scene. A crucial piece of evidence was the semen found on the victim's body. Although DNA testing technology was in its early stages at the time, they managed to secure the genetic traces found, hoping that one day they would be able to find the man to whom the DNA belonged, and thus the murderer. However, there were very few other clues, the most puzzling of which was the lack of defensive wounds on the victim's body. Additionally, no other witnesses came forward to report anything suspicious or to have seen the man the boys described, whose portrait had been drawn. It was also difficult to determine why Sarah had ventured into those bushes in the first place. No signs of a struggle were found in her car. So, what prompted the teenager to leave her vehicle? Everything indicated that the victim had voluntarily exited the car and walked with the murderer to a secluded spot. This could suggest that the killer was someone Sarah knew. However, according to her family, Sarah was exceptionally trusting and helpful, which led to the theory that she might have been lured by someone asking for help. This theory seemed quite plausible. The man might have used a ruse to lure the victim into the bushes, where he then unexpectedly attacked her, strangling her, and after she stopped moving, sexually assaulted her. The sketch of the suspect was first used to verify people associated with the school. Although the boys had described the man they encountered as being around 25 years old, the police decided to include not only school staff in their investigation, but also students. Local residents also became involved in the search for the killer, conducting their own searches for anyone matching the police sketch. The King County Sheriff's Office was flooded with new reports about potential suspects. The police investigated each tip individually, but this effort also yielded little success. Time passed relentlessly, and as months turned into years, the case grew colder, while the perpetrator remained at large, striking fear into the community. On June 12, 1992, which would have been Sarah's birthday, reporters arrived at the school to cover a memorial bench being dedicated to her. Friends of the victim had initiated the project, engraving her favorite phrase, "Carpe diem," on the bench. It had been 6 months since the tragedy, and the investigation had stalled. The police felt powerless, and Sarah's devastated family was slowly coming to terms with the possibility that the case might never be solved. By 2000, about 3,000 leads had been investigated, and hundreds of witnesses had been interviewed. Yet the case was handed down to new generations of detectives as those before them retired from service in the area. Meanwhile, advancements in DNA testing technology in the field of forensics were made, and the CODIS system was introduced, allowing for the addition of criminals' genetic profiles to a database, raising hopes that the DNA found at the crime scene might match someone registered in the system. However, for years, the database yielded no matches. Detectives were convinced that the perpetrator who committed the crime in 1991 might have committed another in the following years, for which he would have been caught, and thus his DNA should have been in the system. Exactly 20 years after the crime, in 2011, a glimmer of hope appeared, a new technology that could help unravel the mystery: genetic genealogy. This method could potentially lead to finding individuals connected to the collected genetic code. The King County Sheriff's Office reached out to the state police for assistance, but they were met with skepticism. At that time, genetic genealogy was considered a technological novelty that might not prove helpful, and it was very costly, which led them to withdraw from the idea. Unexpectedly, Dr. Colin Fitzpatrick, a forensic geneticist, came to the rescue, offering free assistance in this matter. Upon receiving DNA samples from the perpetrator from 20 years ago, she immediately began her work. After more than a year, they managed to find an extremely distant link, a relative from 1620, Robert Fuller, whose family arrived in America on the Mayflower, and whose remains were unearthed by American archaeologists nearly 400 years later. Interestingly, he was an ancestor of Bill Fuller, a friend of Sarah's family, who contributed to the establishment of a memorial bench at the school. It was suspected that this might have pricked Bill's conscience. However, after thorough verification, it turned out that the perpetrator's genetic code did not match Bill's DNA. This, however, did not end the search using genetic genealogy. Over time, several significant breakthroughs in other cases using this method led to a decrease in skepticism regarding its application among investigators, resulting in additional funding for research and the involvement of more researchers in the case. In 2019, they stumbled upon another lead, Edward Nicholas, who was a cousin of Fuller, about whom Bill had no idea. Furthermore, the fact that he had previously been convicted of sexual offenses worked against him. However, after checking the code in the CODIS system, it turned out that he was not responsible for Sarah's murder. The genetic code did not match that found on the victim's body. For certainty, additional DNA tests were conducted, which once again confirmed that Edward was not the person the investigators were looking for. This was yet another disappointment brought by the genetic genealogy method, or at least it seemed so at first glance. However, it turned out that Edward had a brother, Patrick, who, at the time of the tests in 2019, was 55 years old, meaning that at the time of the crime in 1991, he was 27 years old, which coincided with the suspect's profile and the testimonies of the boys who estimated the suspect's age to be around 25 years. From the information gathered, it appeared that Patrick had long hair during those years. Given the number of coincidences, DNA testing was deemed necessary to definitively confirm his guilt. However, the suspect refused to provide a sample of his genetic code, citing constitutional rights, which only intensified suspicions against him. Due to Patrick's reluctance to cooperate, it was decided to obtain his DNA through subterfuge. Several individuals were assigned to follow the suspect closely in order to obtain a DNA sample. They tracked him for several days until one day they found themselves at a laundromat with him, where Patrick decided to smoke a cigarette after dropping off his laundry. The cigarette butt left behind by the potential perpetrator was immediately sent to the laboratory. After testing, it was unequivocally determined that the genetic code matched completely with that found on the body of the 16-year-old girl nearly 30 years earlier. Everything was clear. It was he who was responsible for Sarah's crime, and his semen had been secured on the victim. Patrick Nicholas was arrested. An additional confirmation came from bringing in one of the teenagers who had found the girl's body and showing him a picture of Patrick from that period. He confirmed that he had seen him at the crime scene. The face of this man had stuck in his memory like nothing else before. Surely not without reason. Such a traumatic discovery at the age of 13 is something one remembers for a lifetime. During the interrogation of Patrick Nicholas, when asked about Sarah's murder, instead of clearly denying it, he asked what year it was. This further raised suspicions. What if this was not the only crime he committed, and now he was trying to remember which incident it was? Patrick did not confess to committing the crime and requested a lawyer. In the meantime, it was established that in 1983 he had been arrested for attempting to rape a 21-year-old woman, and during that investigation, it turned out that he was guilty of 2 other sexual offenses for which he was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but he was released early. For unknown reasons, his information was not entered into the registry of individuals convicted of sexual offenses. In early 2023, Patrick stood trial. He faced 3 charges: premeditated murder for sexual gratification, unintentional second-degree murder during the commission of a sexual assault, and thirdly, sexual contact using force, which resulted in his attempt to incapacitate the victim by strangulation, leading to her death. The perpetrator had found himself on the school grounds because there was a bus stop nearby. On his way to work, It turned out that due to inclement weather, the bus did not arrive. Patrick decided to walk to work, taking a shortcut through the school grounds. There, he encountered a girl in a car, whom he attempted to lure out under false pretenses to have sexual intercourse with her. This was the official theory presented by the prosecution, which was not unequivocally confirmed by the perpetrator. Patrick did not plead guilty. However, significant evidence against him led the jury to make a decision within a day, dismissing the charge of premeditated murder while finding him guilty of second-degree murder, unintentional killing during an attempted sexual assault. Patrick Nicholas was sentenced to 45 years and 8 months in prison. By law, he could seek early release only after serving 85% of his sentence. Sarah's family, who had fought for justice for decades, could finally breathe a sigh of relief, knowing that the perpetrator of their loss had been punished. The story of Sarah Yarbrough is not just a tale of tragedy, but also of hope and the struggle for justice. Although her life was brutally cut short, her legacy lived on, inspiring many to take action. At the school she attended, her memory is honored every year in the form of an assembly, by a memorial bench dedicated in her honor. The case of Sarah Yarbrough had long been an example of how injustice can weigh heavily on families, communities, and investigators. Although the technology of that time was inadequate, investigators never ceased to strive to solve this case. The cigarette butt, which might have seemed an insignificant detail at the time of its discovery, became the key to solving the mystery thanks to technology that was unattainable just a few decades ago. It was genetic genealogy that turned out to be the breakthrough that provided answers. A method that allows for the identification of a perpetrator through the analysis of DNA and its familial connections has become a powerful tool in the fight against crime in recent years.